Hello and welcome to Dad Stories. Fathers are important, and this show exists to demonstrate the value of fatherhood by highlighting positive experiences with dads. No father is perfect, and not everyone has had the blessing of a good father figure in their lives. But all of us can benefit from some good stories about good dads. Today we hear from Nathan Lichter, a husband, father, truck driver, and minister from the great state of Iowa. Nathan and I were able to get together and talk about family and fatherhood at a men's camp we both attend regularly. His dad can even be heard in the background here preparing for the evening's worship. Whether your dad is gone or you have the blessing of spending more time with him, I hope that you find today's episode encouraging and inspiring. So Nathan, tell us about your dad.
My dad his name's Tom Lichter, and he's a truck driver, hauls livestock feed. He's been doing that for over 30 years, mostly as long as I can remember. I ended up kind of following in his footsteps, so I kind of do the same thing. But my dad loves music. He plays piano. He actually played in a rock band that toured around out east back when he was about 19 years old. And they would just, like, we're in an entertainment band that played at like hotels and clubs and stuff, so they didn't write any of their own stuff. He during that time he became a Christian and moved back home, and eventually met my mom, got married, and plays in church almost every Sunday, leads worship, and that's a lot of who he is: work and spending time with us and his grandkids, and then playing music. So
What's the path between playing music out east and truck driving in Iowa?
well, he always played. He's a prodigy. He's been playing piano since he was really little. Started plucking away at the piano when he was 4 or 5 years old, and his parents were like, "Yeah, we need to get you lessons." And so he was playing quite well when he was a junior high schooler already, and he was playing at a bar in his hometown or near his hometown, and there was some group of people there playing that were connected to some booking agencies, and one of them said, "Hey, you're really good. We could really get you hooked up with one of these entertainment bands, and you could travel and all this stuff." And so he got a phone call and got hooked up doing that, and did that for about 9 months, but decided the road was not for him. And so when he got off the road, he had a few odd jobs in restaurants, jean factory, and then he drove truck for a company for a little bit, and then he began hauling livestock feed when I was about 3 years old, and he's been doing that ever since. And same company that he's been working for from when he was in his late 20s till he's almost 60 years old now. So that's kind of how he went from potentially probably being able to make it, playing piano in a pretty big way, but decided that wasn't his lifestyle. So
Fair enough. What was it like when you were little? Like, what did you guys do together?
So he worked. Seemed like he worked a lot to me as a little kid. Probably every little kid thinks that. The company he was working for was growing quite a lot. The hog industry was changing in the 90s, and so the company was expanding and feeding a lot more farms. So he worked a lot, but I always loved music. I loved to sing as a kid. I'm not talented with the piano like he is. I play a little guitar, but like I do like to sing, and I can sing pretty well. And we would do that together. So we would play and sing in church together. So we did all the special music stuff at church, and even a few other local entertainment things, like at the fair, at different car club. They asked us to sing for them, just different things like that. Actually, I think we sang at a Mother's Day thing at your home church up in Sloan one time. A mutual friend, I think, up there like got us to come up there and sing one time when I was a kid, and so we shared that kind of passion and did that together, and that was always a lot of fun for us. So when we did other stuff, like he had a mowing side business, and I had to help do that.
Had to help do that? What
Yes.
was it?
Oh yeah.
What's it like working with your dad on a job site?
It was mostly good. taught me a lot, but there was tension sometimes. He really wanted it to be done well and be a good job, and I always felt like he was in a hurry. And sometimes when things would break down, he'd get pretty frustrated. And I'm a kid, and it sometimes felt like I did something wrong. But he had a lot of felt a lot of pressure because it was in addition to his regular job. But yeah, so it I enjoy doing things with my dad. I can work with my dad doing stuff. So but maybe I don't want to own a lawn mowing business with my dad.
Did you become an excellent flashlight holder during that time as well?
Yes, I did. So dad really likes one hobby. He likes his old cars. He's got like 4 old Thunderbirds and a few other old cars. He's got an old Mercury Cyclone. Actually, that's my mom's old car, but that's another story. But he'll buy these old cars for a few $100 that don't look pretty, and they're old classic cars. But he likes making them run, like getting the engine unstuck, and then he'll drive it around. And he doesn't care if it looks good, but he can get it to run. And working on just my mom's car and my car growing up, I was not that good at it. So yeah, I did hold the flashlight a lot and saw him be frustrated sometimes when things didn't work too good there. And then my brother kind of is more like my dad in that way. So now I have my brother and my dad that I ask to help me fix my car. Even though I'm almost 35 years old, I ask my little brother and my dad to help me still.
Fair enough. I think almost everybody has some form of collective trauma over helping their dad repair stuff.
Yep.
The key I've heard is you want to point it where they're looking, not where you're looking.
Right, exactly.
And for some reason, it takes us years to master that skill.
Yep. And don't drop the flashlight down into the engine compartment either. That doesn't usually help either.
Is that a confession?
It probably happened.
Flashlight dropper?
Yeah.
So when did you figure out as a kid or as an adult that your dad was a good man? And how?
There's probably several different ways that it was pretty clear to me. I remember being pretty young, specifically the area I grew up in and where we're from. It has a high immigrant population, and you hear people's attitudes about that. And I always remember my dad kind of going out of his way he didn't talk about people that way. And as a little kid, I remember being 7 years old. He would stop on the side of the road and help people when their cars were broke down. And I met my first black person. I met first Hispanic person because my dad had stopped on the side of the road to help them with their car when their car broke down. And I was 7 years old, and my dad picked up people walking on the side of the road. A hitchhiker one time, which is a big no-no, of course. But dad did it and gave him rides when I was in the car. And that happened over, of course, several times over a few years. And I realized that's when I maybe not at the time, but definitely pretty early on, I realized my dad's a good guy. Because as I got older and then would hear how people talk about people that maybe don't look like you, I realized my dad doesn't do that. My dad actually goes out of his way for
people who might be different than you, and some superficial way.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I knew that early on that my dad was, and I'm not saying a whole bunch of people are like that where I grew up, but
but you notice it when somebody does do that because you automatically contrast it with what you see at home.
Yep. And so that definitely made. Now I'm not stopping on the side of the road to help people, because I wouldn't know. Oh, yeah, your car's broken.
I could drop a flashlight for you.
Yeah, exactly. My dad would know what to do to help them, but yeah, that made an impact. Definitely that, and he would have helped anybody, but just looking back, the way he treated them was different than how I heard people talk about him. So.
Yeah. Someday maybe I'll do a dad story as well, and you'll get to hear my story about how I got to see my dad be like, yeah, you don't treat people different.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. I think a lot of people have some observation where they see their dad behaving in a way that it would be very easy for him to behave otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But they just step up and do the right thing.
Yep.
Who does your dad impact the most? I mean, if he's stopping along the side of the road to help people, yeah, he's impacting their lives at that moment.
Hmm.
But in general, who did he help most?
So my dad has this gift. Younger guys and younger, like teenagers, preteens, are really drawn to hang out with him for some reason. And
So let's stop at that. Why do you think that is?
um, I can't quite put my finger on it. He's very kind, just a nice guy, and I just know that whether it's been at church, sometimes young guys are just, whether it was kind of through me a little bit at first when I was a kid. I remember having a kid who didn't have a lot of friends, and dad invited him to come to our house, and him specifically telling me like, hey, like I want you to hang out with this kid. And I was like, I don't know, dad, like, but then as I grew up, he still would kind of do that a little bit. And a lot of times it was maybe like a friend, and we had a family friend who had a lot of foster kids. And so sometimes dad would kind of step in and like help give some of those kids an experience out on our acreage that those kids wouldn't be able to have like in town, and kind of help out the foster dad in a way too, give him a little bit of a break and just help mentor those kids. And then in his workplace, I've noticed that too, where young guys in their 20s now, dad's almost 60, but guys in their 20s really like hanging out with my dad. And I think we all know like the workforce coming in looks a lot different than it did 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And work attitudes are a lot different. And it's kind of cool to see how he mentors guys in the workplace, how they really look up to him. I've lost count. I can picture a bunch of guys he's hung out with and kind of been there for when they maybe didn't have a great home life growing up. I would say one common thread, bring it back to why I think that is, a lot of the father figures in these situations were either entirely absent or not quality, or maybe it was the foster kid, so had a good foster dad at church, but like they were there because there was a problem. And so for what, and my dad had, his parents divorced when he was 11, and my grandpa's not a bad person, but he was pretty absent. And so I think having that opportunity to pour into somebody just felt natural to him. And not to overanalyze it, but if that was what he was lacking. And sometimes as kids, me and my brother and sister, sometimes we'll look back and be like, Dad, why are you hanging out and spending time with this guy? And I really wanted you to come do this thing with me, and you didn't. And and that was something that really frustrated us. But I remember my younger brother one time, several years back, I was really frustrated about a situation like that, where I felt like dad was going out of his way for somebody. The kid had a terrible childhood, and I was mad that he wasn't helping me with something. And my brother said, Nathan, like, dad's not worried about us. And and I was probably in my mid-20s, and my brother was in college, and that really, like, wow, younger brother, you're way wiser than me right now. But that made a lot of sense. And so even like, okay, you asked earlier, when did I realize my dad was a good man? Like, it's kind of like always been hitting me once in a while. So like as a 25-year-old, realizing that, wow, like you're right, Andrew, like that dad that's true. He's doing that. That's why, so.
Do you think part of it might have been he was more attuned to how those kids felt because he grew up that way?
I think so, a little bit. Yeah. Yep.
You had mentioned in a class we did together that your dad always wanted to make sure your home was safe and secure. How did he go about that, and why do you think that was such an important thing?
So, yeah, like I said, he came from a broken home. My grandma and grandpa, there was a lot of drama and a lot of tension, but there wasn't. I don't think there was a lot of violence, or any really, but definitely they were not a family that worried about making sure what they did made their kids feel like safe and secure. They loved their kids in the best way they probably knew how, but they were so wrapped up in themselves. And then my mom did come from an abusive not to her, but to my grandmother and my there was abuse going on and alcohol. And so when my parents got together, my dad, he indulged in some things that, I don't want my kids indulging in when they're a teenager. But my pretty early on, after my parents were dating and engaged and married, they kind of right away were like, like we want our homes to look different than ours did growing up. And so they made a conscious decision to try not to fight in front of us. At least I assume it was conscious because it didn't happen very often. Not that, not that they never did, but they tried not to. They did not keep alcohol in the home, although they never told us, to stay away from it because that's a sin. They just were pretty open about like, well, I knew where they had come from even as a kid, and I don't know why I knew that, but it wasn't a secret. And they didn't look down on anybody who did have alcohol in the home, but I just knew that there was a reason that they had chose to do it a little differently. And I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't, it wasn't until I was in college that I realized that there was some very conscious decision. So yeah, definitely their growing up affected them. And yeah, like there's probably a lot more, but I would say that's definitely something I know for sure, that since their homes were so broken and dysfunctional, they wanted to do the best they could to have us not feel the way they did as kids. In that way.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that people stress out about when they come from either a broken home or a home that they couldn't look back on and say things were healthy,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like concerned that they would eventually create the same environment. And we all know that it's easy to fall into cycles.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking away from them is difficult, but it's not impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really cool thing with your dad and with your mom is for them to say, we know that we came from a unhealthy childhood, but we're going to give the opposite of that to our kids. And that's a pretty brave thing, actually.
Yep.
Let me take a second to tell you about a company I feel strongly about. We all have a responsibility to our family and our community to be ready to help should an emergency arise. We all want to be an asset, not a liability in a crisis situation. That's where Woodline Defense comes in. Woodline Defense is a firearms instruction company based out of Omaha, Nebraska, started by a former cop who is now a pastor and teacher. They specialize in training and equipping individuals for higher levels of competence with firearms, and have programs specifically designed to help churches set up and improve security teams. They have rifle and pistol instruction from basic to advanced, along with a concealed carry class. They help folks feel comfortable, but they also push them to get better. You can find out more at woodlinedefense.com or reach out to them on Facebook. Woodline Defense, training for those who have a heart to protect others. So we've got a pretty good idea of your dad as a person. We've seen a lot of his character come out. What did it look like in practice? Like in action, what do you see your dad doing? What's a time that you would say that is peak dad for him?
To preface this, he probably wouldn't be like super proud of exactly how this particular story went down, but it was definitely seared into my memory, a core memory. But I was probably 7 years old, and we lived in the country, but we had next door neighbors. So our houses it was almost like being in town, just the two of us. And we got along with them okay. They were a little different than we were. We weren't really close. It was just proximity we were, but we weren't in very deep relationship. But we had this little dog, and we had two dogs, and they were really dumb dogs and bad dogs. And they ran over to the neighbors, and this old man, he was probably 70 years old, and he always looked like he was 1,000 years old to me. I ran over to get the dog, and I'm this little kid, and he came out of his house, and I must, it was obvious what I was there doing, and they were nice enough people, but he didn't like that the dog was over there, and he just yelled at me and said, "You get that dog out of here, or I'll shoot him." And like, I knew the dogs were dumb because my dad had expressed frustration about these dogs and probably had even maybe threatened to do that himself. I was a little kid, and I I started crying, and I was mortified because this guy threatened to do that. It just scared me. I never heard anybody say something like that before. I think was the big thing. And I turned around. I don't remember the dogs. I couldn't catch them. The dogs were long running around all over. I remember I walked through the gate into our yard, and I was looking up, crying and sniffing, and I look up, and this is all within like 100 feet. I look up, and there's my dad coming from around the garage, and I was like, kind of whimpering and sobbing. I said, "Dad, he's going to shoot the dog," and Dad said, "Yeah, I heard him." And I Dad marched right past me over to the neighbor's yard, and I just kind of stayed by the house, and I proceeded to hear my dad give the neighbor a piece of his mind. And again, my dad probably wouldn't, I know he wouldn't be proud of that moment in that way, but at that time, I remember, in retrospect, I couldn't probably articulate it then, but I knew my dad would always stick up for me. I knew that, like, so even though my dad wasn't perfect, and sometimes we got into it growing up and got into fights about different things, like I knew there were other times growing up, my dad didn't coddle me or anything, but there were a few different things that were like, "Ooh, you're 15, but you're not ready for that yet." One time, my boss, who was also his boss, I worked part time, accused me of something in a roundabout way, and really shook me. I got accused of not cleaning something, and somebody slipped and fell and broke their leg or hurt themselves somehow. And it got back to me that was my fault. And I was 15 years old, and that scared the crap out of me. And my dad went in and told his boss that that is not cool. Like, he's 15 years old, like, and it wasn't my fault. Like, that was the other thing so I knew, like, kind of like, my dad didn't coddle me, or as we, use the snowplow term you've used, but there were moments where he's like, "No, that's not cool." And he wasn't a confrontational person, but he was never afraid to confront something if it was not right. So I always knew he'd stick up for me.
What I like about both those stories is what made the difference wasn't the dogs that were admittedly dumb.
Right, yes.
It wasn't that there was a situation that happened at work.
Mm-hmm.
It's how people addressed his son,
Mm-hmm.
and he felt the need to stand up for you.
Yep.
That's kind of neat, because sometimes people get caught up in the details of it, and they could be like, "Well, your dog shouldn't have been over there."
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yep.
But you don't talk to my son that way.
Right.
Like,
the thing I remember hearing was my dad yelling, "You don't say that to a 7-year-old kid." Like, that was all I really heard, and I'm like, whoa. So
yeah. So it has in our notes here that, well, your dad stood up for you. He
Mhm.
also would help people out when they had problems along the road. But you have a specific story that you would like to tell about a time that he helped people get unstuck.
Well, after looking at your template, and it said, like, seeing your dad in action. So, we could say those other things were in dad in action, but, like, so I was able to work part time where he worked, and eventually I got my CDL, and now I'm a truck driver. And that company helped me get my CDL. My dad trained me, so, like, we were able to kind of do that together. And in the feed hauling business, there was a time where, I don't know if you know this, but in holidays and snowstorms, animals don't stop eating. Sometimes they still need their feed.
It's actually kind of inconsiderate of them.
Yes, it is. And some companies are better about, with radar and technology, we can kind of like plan ahead for snowstorms almost now, which is really nice. But I remember being 19 to 23 years old, different times where we were going in weather we never should have been going in. The mailman never would have gone out, and getting stuck in slushy snowstorms. And my dad worked night shift, and so did I. And I just remember thinking, and knowing all the other coworkers thought my dad was just the absolute coolest person ever, because he hardly ever got stuck himself, and yet he get the job done in the most precarious of places. I mean, we delivered in really hilly places all over northwest Iowa. And I remember very specifically one time I got stuck at a farm, and it was just so slushy. I just couldn't move. And there was this little hill, and and I had to wait for my dad, who was also working that night, to come pull me out. And so I'm waiting for him to get there. He gets there. He hops up in my truck and rolls back, rolls forward, rolls back, gets unstuck in like 30 seconds. And I had spent about 45 minutes trying to get unstuck. And he didn't have to pull me out. He just got in and did it. And he got out, and I was pretty frustrated. And I said, "What did you do what was I doing wrong? What did you do?" And he just starts chuckling and is like, "I just drove it out." And yeah, that just,
Thanks for the advice.
yeah,
That's
thanks,
helpful.
Dad. Yeah,
Now,
that was
now next
awesome.
time this comes up, I know that you can just drive it out.
Right, yeah. But he would help a lot of guys, especially young new drivers. He'd go get right there and help them out and give them tips on what to do. And he's just been doing it for so long. But yeah, that very specifically, I was like, man, I was mad, but I was like, man, my dad's so cool.
You've mentioned multiple times your dad's faith and
Hmm.
how he became a Christian out east and he came back and he's involved in your church.
Hmm.
What is it about his faith or about his relationship with God or
Hmm.
anything? What is it that most stands out to you that you see as the most important?
So he always his big thing for him was he started reading the scriptures for himself. And there were different people that stepped into his life and planted seeds in him. And for him, seeing the scriptures for himself and it coming alive and the Holy Spirit working on him through the scriptures. So he's always put a high value on that and tried to instill that in us as kids. And I remember being 7 years old. I turned 7, and I remember sitting in our living room, and my mom and dad walked up to me and handed me my first Adventure NIV Bible, right? And
This with the shiny cover.
yep, with the
oh,
you
yeah.
move it and they kind of sparkle. It's so cool. I still have it. I love that thing. But Dad, I remember Mom and Dad both gave it to me, and Dad specifically said, "I want you to read this. Like, I want you to read it." And then I don't remember this next part, but Dad does, and he'll tell people this. When I was about 12 years old, I had finally read it from cover to cover. So from when I was 7 to when I was 12, I read it from cover to cover, and I remembered that I did it. But Dad remembers me going to him and saying, "Okay, Dad, I did it." He's like, "You did what?" "Well, I read it. I read the whole thing." And he remembers me. I kind of don't remember that, but he does. And that's how God revealed himself to my dad, was just through people connecting with him and working on him, but definitely through the scriptures. And so he always tried to instill that in us. And so having obviously the way he, like I said before, how he treated people that maybe other people that looked different than him, that there was maybe a stigma about some people. Dad didn't show that. So his that
It was
was
informed by his faith.
yes, exactly. And how he mentored young guys, informed by his faith, but what he instilled in us. And so now, like, and even as a high schooler, and then when I went on to college and I didn't know what I wanted to do, I knew I changed my major as a halfway through sophomore year to religion. So I had to get all my religion classes done in 2.5 years. And my dad was the one who encouraged me, like, to do that. He never went to college, and he's the one who told me, like, he was proud of me. And we have lots of talks about the scriptures, about theology, about what we're seeing when we're reading together. I know he loves that. I love it too. And so that's um, I'm not giving you probably the best fullest picture I can, but I know, like, I cherish like that about him, that he's besides that he's a good man, that he loves us and all that stuff, but that he's
Yeah,
kind of like,
all that
yeah,
little,
all that,
all
like,
that little
that good
stuff.
dad stuff. But he's like instilled like that in me and engaged in that with me my whole life. Encouraged me to do that, and we still share that. So I remember him giving me that Bible then, but yeah, it still is there.
I almost imagine when you come up to him at 12 years old and go, "Hey, Dad, I read the whole Bible."
Uh-huh.
I almost imagine him having his Han Solo moment. The great job, kid, don't get cocky.
That's right.
So you clearly have picked up some of those traits from him. You've picked up your faith that you share with him. But on top of that, you also have some other stuff that you picked up from. What are some traits that you have actually adopted from your father? You said you didn't get the mechanic stuff and all
Right.
of that. What did you get from him?
So what did I get? I think I would hope that I have the same compassion for people the way I see him. I think he's a heck of a lot better at it than me. I find myself being maybe cynical towards people in a way that he's not sometimes. And but as I've gotten older and kind of matured, I realize I've been trying to do a better job at seeing people the way God sees them. And then I realized, oh, my dad was really good at that, and I'm trying to, trying to do that myself. So we're similar in a lot of ways, just our personalities in a lot of things. There's not probably one super specific thing where I'm like, oh yeah, like I've got this really great trait. There's some weird idiosyncrasies. Like I put off projects. My dad puts off projects. Like my brother and sister are like, oh, how come dad's not getting this done? I'm like, I don't know, because I'm not getting that same thing done at my house that I need to be getting done. So I've definitely like him in that way.
Did you end up getting into trucking because you went along with your dad on any of those trips, or did he bring you along with him to work?
Yeah.
And is that something you enjoyed, going along with him to
Yeah.
those things? And
So when he was driving truck and he had to work like every other Saturday, and he would bring one of us kids with him we'd take turns. And so, yeah, I remember going to work with him. They wouldn't let him do that now. That's policy. But back then, yeah, the boss, they're a pretty small company at the time. The boss was like, yeah, bring your kids along. And so, yeah, I always knew my dad was a truck driver and thought that was kind of cool. I really didn't ever picture myself doing that as a high schooler. I was like, oh yeah, I could or couldn't do that. Like I'd rather work in the mill or do something different. And when I was in college, I got my CDL, and then all of a sudden I could get paid more, and I would go home on college breaks and drive truck just to make money, and that helped pay for like maybe my room and board that quarter or something. Like I was able to complement some of my student loans with making decent money, and that was because dad, just the connection through that company. But he helped me with that and kind of didn't really push me to do it. It wasn't like, oh, you're going to be a truck driver just like me someday. It was just like, well, gosh, like this would be easy to like, we could very easily help you do this. And so we did. And then here I am with a few kind of ins and outs from it as I've grown up. But like I've been driving truck pretty much since I was 19 years old. I'm 35 now. So yeah, it definitely, because of, it wasn't like pressure to do it, but it just was an opportunity, and that's what he was able to kind of, with his connection, help me do. So
did you ever get in big trouble? And how did your dad handle it?
yeah, there was a few times. There were a few times where I felt like, and where dad would admit that, yeah, maybe he was unreasonable in a few ways. But there were a few times where I got in trouble and I straight up deserved it. And
Hold on, we're being vague here. What'd you do?
Well, this is
only going out on the internet.
okay.
That's
Yeah,
all right.
this is probably tough to, be kind of tough to talk about a little bit. But so I was 16 years old, and I had a cousin a female cousin who we were really close. Hey, let's have a sleepover. My cousin kind of made it clear to me that one of her friends was going to be there, and there was this part of me that was like, that'd be kind of cool. Like, mom and dad don't need to know that part. Like, straight up, that's what I was thinking. But of course, I was like, well, me and her don't have a thing. Like, nah. And so I kind of like vaguely kind of let my mom know that's what was going on, but not about that friend, and that I was going to be there. And my mom was even there for a little while at my aunt's house. So she left though, and I stayed. I had my driver's license, so I was still in town with my car. And so yeah, we're just, and we weren't doing anything. We're just hanging out. But it was me, my cousin, and her friend. And then all of a sudden the phone rings and it's late. It's like 10:30, and it's my dad. He's like, "Where are you at?" I'm like, well, I'm staying over. He's like, no, you're not. I was like, well, mom knew I was, which was half true. Looking back, I had straight up kind of like tried to avoid it as much as possible because I knew that they wouldn't like that. And I remember he was pretty upset with me. I tried to save face, try to explain my way out of it. And the more I tried to explain my way out of it, the more I realized, like, oh, that was stupid. So I drove home. Parents sat me down, and they didn't yell at me. Dad didn't yell at me about it, but he very firmly was like, "There's just some situations you shouldn't put yourself in." And like I knew he was right, but I didn't want to hear it. And he, I was pretty upset at them, but I was more upset with myself because I knew that was that was kind of dumb to think that was a good idea. And I was pretty ashamed. And I don't think they grounded me. I might have had to, I don't know. I don't remember for sure, but I remember feeling pretty stupid. But I do remember him, hey, we love you, that's why you can't, we had to tell you to come home, and you can't be putting yourself in situations like that, was basically how it went. And yeah, so I remember that, and it was a good lesson.
What tools that your dad gave you as a parent or that you observed are you using with your own kids?
Well, we've given all of our kids a Bible when they turn about 7, and challenged our kids to read it. We, kind of the same way, like, hey, like, we want you to engage in this. So tried to do that, as my kids have started going to school. I was actually homeschooled, so I didn't have as many opportunities where I was engaging with a lot of other kids. I mean, we had youth group friends and other homeschool families and neighbors and stuff. But so going to school for my kids is kind of foreign to me. But encouraging my kids to be like a good friend, because just seeing how my dad is a good friend to people, like I said, the people he stopped to help, or the way he mentors people, and just so encouraging my kids to, just knowing that school can be brutal sometimes for some people, so encouraging them to be good friends, and be somebody that people can like look to.
It sounds like you've had a great experience growing up with your dad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks,
I appreciate it. And you have a great day. Thanks for listening. And again, if you'd like to get in touch with our team, you can email me at hroberthanson@gmail.com. We hope to inspire new dads, tell stories about good dads, and highlight positive fatherhood along the way. If you'd like to be informed about future content, subscribe to the show, and we sure would appreciate it if you could leave a positive review.